In the summer of 1883, federal investigators reached a place known locally as the Garden of Eden. A Christian community in southwestern Kansas had been abandoned mysteriously overnight. Beneath the flower beds, they would forever be haunted by what they found. Without a trace, 9 families had vanished over 11 years, their leaders saying they had left for missionary work. But skeletal remains were discovered by investigators in mass graves, their life savings stolen. A sanctuary was not what the New Eden Christian community was. It was a killing field. The story of Prophet Isaiah Richardson and his family of killers continues, but this channel isn't for everyone. Only the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truth behind America's most disturbing mysteries should watch. If you're brave enough to hear stories few channels tell, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments what state you're from. Everything you thought you knew about faith and trust will be questioned by this story. On the Kansas prairie, what happened during those 11 years would become one of the most systematically concealed crimes in American history. And tonight, you'll learn why the federal government wanted this story to vanish forever. The year was 1871, and possibility and danger still marked the raw Kansas frontier. 60 miles southwest lay Dodge City, a lawless cattle town where Saturday night gunshots punctuated the air like Sunday morning church bells. But 30 miles northeast of Dodge, in a fertile valley where Crooked Creek meandered through endless grassland, a different settlement was taking root. Nearly 2,000 acres of prime farmland were occupied by the New Eden Christian community, purchased with what seemed to be substantial Eastern investment. Unlike rough-hewn homesteads scattered across the prairie, New Eden boasted impressive wooden structures. A grand meeting hall with stained glass windows shipped from Chicago, multiple dormitory buildings for dozens of families, workshops for blacksmithing and carpentry, and most striking of all, the Prophet's house, a 3-story Victorian mansion impossibly grand for the Kansas wilderness. In the spring of 1871, Prophet Isaiah Richardson arrived in Kansas with his wife, Elder Sarah Richardson, and their 23-year-old son, Joshua. A tall, commanding figure was Isaiah, with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight to a person's soul. Deep and resonant, his voice carried the authority of someone who had communed with the divine, capable of making grown men weep with conviction or tremble with fear. A different kind of power was possessed by Sarah, his wife of 26 years. The quiet, watchful intelligence of someone who noticed everything and forgot nothing. With an efficiency bordering on supernatural, she managed the community's daily operations. Their son Joshua combined his father's physical presence with his mother's calculating mind, serving as the community's enforcer and the one who welcomed new families to their promised land. A unique doctrine called divine simplicity was preached by the Richardson family. The belief was that true Christians should abandon worldly possessions and live in communal harmony, sharing all resources for God's greater glory. A life free from frontier struggles was promised to arriving families. No more failed crops. No more fear of Indian raids. No more winter starvation. In exchange, families would contribute their worldly goods to the community treasury and submit to the spiritual guidance of Prophet Isaiah. By the end of 1871, 14 families had joined. By 1872, there were 28. By 1874, New Eden had reached its stable population of 35 families, approximately 175 men, women, and children living in what appeared to be perfect Christian harmony. Their life savings, their livestock, their tools, and most importantly, their unquestioning faith in Prophet Isaiah's divine mission were brought by each family. Remarkable prosperity was seen in the community. Despite the harsh Kansas climate, gardens yielded vegetables in abundance. Exceptional quality furniture and tools were produced in the workshops and sold in distant markets. 6 days a week, children attended school, learning not just reading and arithmetic, but also music and art. Times of fellowship and spiritual instruction were evening meals in the Great Hall, with Prophet Isaiah delivering sermons that spoke to the deepest longings of the human heart. But rules existed in New Eden, rules that newcomers learned gradually. All correspondence with the outside world required approval by Elder Sarah. Visits from relatives or friends were discouraged. After all, worldly influences that could corrupt the community's spiritual purity might be brought by them. Most importantly, once families committed their worldly goods to the community treasury, leaving became complicated. Visions of families who tried to leave were shown by God to Prophet Isaiah, he explained. Terrible visions of failure, death, and damnation awaited those who turned their backs on the divine calling. What visitors didn't see were the closed-door meetings between the Richardson family, always held in the prophet's house after the evening meal. They didn't notice how certain families seemed to struggle with doubt or discontent, asking uncomfortable questions about community finances or challenging the absolute authority Prophet Isaiah claimed to possess. Most importantly, they didn't realize that the beautiful gardens surrounding the meeting hall, gardens that Elder Sarah tended with devoted care, would eventually hold secrets capable of shattering their faith in humanity forever. A Christian community had not been the Richardson family's purpose in coming to Kansas. They had come to perfect a system that would make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams, all while hiding their crimes behind the unassailable walls of religious devotion. On a bitter February night in 1872, the first murder happened, exactly 10 months after the Miller family had arrived at New Eden. But to understand the true horror of what occurred, we must first understand how carefully the Richardson family had planned every detail of their unholy enterprise. Herman Miller had been growing restless. Mainly consisting of memorizing biblical passages and learning trades that seemed designed to benefit the community rather than prepare them for independent lives was the promised education for his children. More troubling, Herman had begun to question the community's finances. He had contributed $400 in valuable livestock to the treasury. Yet when he asked Elder Sarah about purchasing winter clothing for his children, she told him the community couldn't afford such luxuries. That February evening, Herman approached Prophet Isaiah after the community's dinner in the Great Hall. Unaware that they were about to witness the beginning of a pattern that would claim 9 families over the next 11 years, other families were settling into their evening routines. "Brother Isaiah," Herman said, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "I've been thinking about our family's contribution to the treasury. $400 plus our livestock and tools. That's more than some men see in 5 years. Yet my wife tells me we can't afford winter coats for the children." Swift and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's reaction. His blue eyes flashed with what appeared to be righteous anger, but Joshua Richardson, watching from across the hall, recognized it as something else entirely, the cold fury of a predator whose prey had just revealed dangerous intelligence. Quickly the confrontation escalated, with Herman growing more insistent about accountability and Isaiah becoming more dramatically offended by what he called worldly thinking. Finally, Prophet Isaiah raised his hand for silence. "Brother Herman, I can see the devil has been whispering doubts in your ear. Come to my house after evening prayers and we'll seek divine guidance together." At 10 o'clock that night, expecting a private discussion about his concerns, Herman Miller walked through the snow to the prophet's house. Joshua Richardson met him at the door, explaining that his father was waiting in the study. A comfortable room on the first floor was the study, lined with religious books and warmed by a large fireplace. With minor variations, what happened next would be repeated 8 more times over the following decade. "Brother Herman," Isaiah began, his voice gentle and concerned. "I want you to know I understand your worries. But God has shown me something remarkable about your family's future. A special mission that will bring great glory to his name." As Isaiah spoke, Herman noticed that Joshua had entered the room and was standing behind him. Suddenly uneasy, something in the younger man's posture made Herman. But before he could turn around completely, Joshua's powerful hands were around his throat. Brief but violent was the struggle. A strongman hardened by years of frontier life was Herman Miller, but he was no match for Joshua's calculated brutality. Within minutes, Herman's body lay still on the study floor, his neck broken with professional efficiency. Before coming to Kansas, the Richardson family had practiced this technique, perfecting their method of killing without leaving obvious wounds or excessive blood. They had also prepared for every other aspect of what they called the harvest. While Joshua disposed of Herman's body in a specially prepared pit behind the prophet's house, Isaiah and Sarah went to the Miller family's quarters. They woke Ruth Miller with gentle voices, explaining that Herman had suffered a heart attack during their prayer session and had passed peacefully into God's arms. 3 days after Herman's murder, the Miller family supposedly departed for California in the early morning hours before the rest of the community awakened. Prophet Isaiah explained that Ruth had received a divine vision calling her family to missionary work among gold miners and that Joshua had escorted them to the railroad station in Dodge City. Of course, the Miller family never left New Eden alive. On that cold February morning, Ruth Miller and her 4 children joined Herman in what would become Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Swift were their deaths. Poison in their morning coffee, administered by Elder Sarah with the same gentle care she showed in all her domestic duties. By the time the rest of New Eden awakened, the Miller family's belongings had been carefully sorted and stored. Their valuable items would be sold in distant towns. Their life savings would be added to the Richardson family's growing treasury, and their bodies would be buried in what Elder Sarah would designate as the community's first memorial garden, a beautiful flower bed where the faithful could remember departed loved ones and pray for missionaries spreading God's word in distant lands. The Miller family's departure was mourned by the other families in New Eden, and they prayed for their success in California. They had no idea they were praying over their graves. A pattern that would become terrifyingly routine over the next decade was established in the months following the Miller family's disappearance. The community entered a period of mourning and reflection. With Prophet Isaiah delivering increasingly powerful sermons about sacrifice, divine calling, and the temporary nature of earthly attachments, the remaining families drew closer together, finding comfort in their shared faith and their trust in the Richardson family's spiritual guidance. Its careful pacing was the beauty of the Richardson family system. They understood that eliminating families too frequently would create suspicion. So they spaced their activities strategically between murders. They focused on recruiting new families, managing the community's legitimate prosperity, and most importantly, identifying their next victims through careful psychological observation. Throughout 1872 and 1873, new families continued to arrive with remarkable regularity. Drawn by stories of New Eden's success that spread through church networks across the Midwest, the community maintained its stable population of 35 families, with new arrivals replacing those who had been called to missionary service or who had left for legitimate reasons. In the spring of 1873, Thomas Hartwell and his family arrived from Ohio, bringing substantial savings and 2 teenage sons who showed promise as craftsmen. A school teacher had been Thomas, and his intellectual curiosity made him valuable for managing New Eden's educational programs. But by the autumn of 1873, Thomas had begun asking uncomfortable questions about record-keeping and financial accountability that made him dangerous to the Richardson family's control. On November 15, 1873, a sudden illness struck Thomas Hartwell during evening prayers. He collapsed in the meeting hall, writhing in apparent agony before falling still. A carefully measured dose of water hemlock had been added to Thomas's evening tea by Elder Sarah, who had extensive knowledge of medicinal plants gathered from the Kansas prairie. Thomas's tragic death was mourned by the community, and Prophet Isaiah received another divine vision. God, he announced, had revealed that Thomas's widow, Mary, and their sons were called to join a special missionary expedition to work among Scandinavian immigrants in Minnesota Territory. 3 days after Thomas's funeral, the surviving Hartwell family supposedly departed for their new mission. Like the Miller family before them, the Hartwells never left New Eden alive. Their bodies joined the growing collection in Elder Sarah's memorial garden. Their worldly goods were added to the Richardson family's treasury, their deaths explained away by divine mission and spiritual calling. In 1874, the Kowalski family arrived from Illinois. Polish immigrants with skills in metalwork that proved valuable to the community's workshops. But an old-world skepticism about religious authority was possessed by Stephen Kowalski, making him question Prophet Isaiah's absolute control over community finances. In February 1875, the Kowalski family perished in a tragic accident when their quarters caught fire during a winter storm. According to Joshua's tearful account, he had tried desperately to rescue them, but the fire spread too quickly. In 1875, Elder Peterson joined the community, bringing his wife and daughter, along with substantial banking experience that initially seemed useful for managing New Eden's increasingly complex financial operations. But by early 1876, discrepancies between the community's supposed poverty and its actual expenditures had been noticed by Peterson. During a severe prairie storm in May 1876, Elder Peterson was struck by lightning while working in the fields. His widow and daughter soon received a divine calling to missionary work among railroad construction crews in Colorado. New lessons about refining their methods were taught to the Richardson family by each elimination. They learned to vary their techniques, sometimes accidents, sometimes illness, sometimes divine calling that separated families from their resources before their elimination. They also discovered that maintaining detailed records of their victims' assets, while dangerous, was necessary for converting stolen property into usable wealth through sales in distant markets. By the end of 1876, 4 families had been eliminated, and the Richardson family's private treasury contained nearly $50,000 in cash, plus valuable property and livestock. More importantly, they had perfected their system of identifying problematic families, manipulating religious devotion to maintain control, and eliminating threats while maintaining their reputation as devoted Christian leaders. No suspicion was had by the community members who remained that they were living alongside a carefully constructed death trap. For years, the vast majority of families lived peaceful, productive lives in New Eden. They saw only the Richardson family's apparent devotion to Christian principles, the community's material prosperity, and the occasional inspiring examples of faithful families who had accepted God's calling to carry the gospel to distant and dangerous places. When letters arrived from the outside world asking about missing relatives, masterpieces of religious rhetoric and believable explanation were Elder Sarah's responses. When government officials occasionally inquired about land ownership or tax obligations, meticulous was Prophet Isaiah's documentation and apparently flawless was his legal compliance. A period of increasing confidence for the Richardson family was marked by the years 1877 through 1880, but also growing danger as their success began to attract unwanted attention. They had eliminated 4 families without creating suspicion, accumulated substantial wealth, and established New Eden as one of the most prosperous religious communities on the Kansas frontier. But success had made them bold, and boldness was about to lead them into risks that would ultimately expose their crimes. In April 1877, the Brennan family arrived from Missouri, fleeing debts that had destroyed their farming operation. An Irish Catholic was Patrick Brennan, who had converted to Protestant Christianity after marrying his wife Margaret, and this religious transition had alienated him from his extended family back east. The Brennans brought their 6 children, ranging from 8 to 20, plus nearly $700 in savings that represented their entire life's work. One quality that made him ultimately incompatible with the Richardson family system was possessed by Patrick Brennan. He was a natural investigator. His Irish Catholic background had taught him to be wary of religious authority, and his experience with financial ruin had made him skeptical of promises that seemed too good to be true. By the winter of 1877, uncomfortable questions about the families who had supposedly departed for missionary work had been begun by Patrick. "Brother Isaiah," Patrick said one evening after community prayers, "I've been wondering about the families that have left for missionary work. In 3 years, I've never received a single letter from any of them, despite writing several myself. Don't missionaries usually maintain correspondence with their supporting communities?" Immediate and calculated was Prophet Isaiah's response. "Brother Patrick, I'm troubled by your lack of faith in God's mysterious ways. Families called to frontier mission work often find themselves too isolated and busy to maintain regular correspondence. We must trust that they are fulfilling God's will even when we cannot see the results." But Patrick's questions continued and they grew more specific. Why did departing families always leave so suddenly? Why were their destinations always vague and difficult to verify? Why did the community keep no official records of missionary activities that could be shared with supporting churches in other states? Their most audacious yet was the Richardson family's solution. In March 1878, they staged what appeared to be a miraculous divine intervention. During evening prayers, Prophet Isaiah suddenly collapsed, writhing on the floor of the meeting hall in apparent supernatural agony. Elder Sarah and Joshua rushed to his aid while the assembled community watched in horror as their spiritual leader seemed to battle with invisible forces. After nearly an hour of this terrifying display, Prophet Isaiah rose to his feet, his face radiant with apparent divine revelation. In a voice trembling with religious ecstasy, he announced that God had shown him a vision of terrible danger threatening New Eden. Satan, he revealed, had sent agents to infiltrate the community and destroy it from within by spreading doubt and questioning divine authority. Identified by this revelation as the primary agent of Satan's influence, Patrick Brennan faced a choice. Submit completely to Prophet Isaiah's authority or be expelled from the community to face the harsh Kansas prairie alone with his family. Terrified by the supernatural events she had witnessed and desperate to protect her children, his wife Margaret begged Patrick to apologize and demonstrate his renewed faith. Complete and heartbreaking was Patrick's capitulation. He publicly confessed his sins before the entire community, admitted that Satan had corrupted his thoughts with doubt and suspicion, and pledged absolute obedience to Prophet Isaiah's divine guidance. But no intention of allowing Patrick Brennan to live was held by the Richardson family. His questions had been too intelligent, his skepticism too dangerous, and his influence over other families too significant. On April 20, 1878, Patrick Brennan died in his sleep, apparently of a heart attack brought on by the spiritual stress of his battle with Satan. Devastated by Patrick's death and convinced that his doubts had somehow caused his divine punishment, Margaret Brennan and her 6 children readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation that they were called to missionary work among Irish immigrants in Colorado mining camps. Their tragic loss would make them powerful witnesses for the importance of religious obedience. The now established pattern was followed by the Brennan family's departure for Colorado, except that their elimination provided the Richardson family with their largest single haul of assets, $700 in cash, plus valuable personal property that could be sold discreetly in distant markets. Two more families would fall victim to the Richardson system between 1879 and 1881. The Schmidt family, German immigrants who made the mistake of questioning the community's lack of contact with Lutheran churches in their homeland, died in a food poisoning incident that affected only their household. The Caldwell family met their end in 1881 when Patriarch William Caldwell's drinking problem led him to make indiscreet comments about missing families and suspicious deaths. But it was the elimination of the Caldwell family that would ultimately bring down the Richardson enterprise because it included a victim who was too young to be manipulated by religious authority and too intelligent to accept the explanations that satisfied traumatized adults. On the frontier, 16-year-old Emma Caldwell had grown up where death was a frequent visitor and children learned early to observe adult behavior with careful attention. With simple observation after her mother's natural death from consumption in late 1880, Emma's investigation began. She noticed that very specific questions about her mother's family back east were asked by Elder Sarah. Did they write letters regularly? Would they expect to hear from the Caldwells soon? How much did they know about the family's plans in Kansas? When Emma was helping Elder Sarah sort through her mother's belongings, she noticed that all correspondence and family records were set aside by Elder Sarah. These documents will be important when God calls your family to missionary service, Elder Sarah explained, speaking as if such a calling was already determined rather than merely possible. Patterns in the community's missionary departures began to be paid attention to by Emma. She realized that families chosen for elimination were always those who had questioned community policies or possessed resources that made their elimination particularly profitable. More disturbing was her discovery of a hidden storage room beneath the prophet's house containing personal belongings from families who had supposedly departed for frontier missions but had left behind their most precious possessions. In January 1881, a desperate decision was made by Emma. Detailed letters describing her observations and suspicions were written by her, addressed to the sheriff in Dodge City, the federal marshal in Wichita, and her mother's brother in Illinois. But before she could mail the letters, her activities were discovered by Elder Sarah. The established pattern was followed by the Caldwell family's elimination in February 1881. But Emma's desperate attempt to expose the truth had planted the first seeds of fear in the Richardson family's minds. For the first time since they had begun their murderous enterprise, they faced the possibility that their crimes might be discovered and punished. Their first serious mistakes in nearly a decade of perfect murders were led to by the Richardson family's growing paranoia in the wake of Emma Caldwell's investigation. Emma's attempted exposure had failed, but her intelligence and determination had shown them how vulnerable their system could be to a victim who was smart enough to recognize patterns and brave enough to seek outside help. The beginning of the end for the Richardson family's reign of terror was marked by the elimination of the Caldwell family in February 1881, though they didn't realize it at the time. Emma's death had been necessary to protect their enterprise, but her final words, shouted in desperation as Joshua cornered her against a cliff face, would haunt Elder Sarah for months afterward. I wrote 3 letters. They're already mailed. Everyone will know what you've done here. Of course, Emma had been lying. Still hidden in her clothing were the letters, never having reached any post office or government official. But something no other victim had managed was achieved by her bluff. It planted genuine fear in the Richardson family's minds about the possibility of outside investigation. A series of decisions that would ultimately expose their crimes was led to by this fear. First, they decided to accelerate their timeline for leaving Kansas, planning to liquidate their remaining assets and relocate to California before any potential investigation could threaten them. Second, they began eliminating evidence more aggressively, burning documents and personal items that they had previously preserved as trophies of their successful operations. Most fatally, they decided to eliminate one final family before their departure. The Hoffmans, recent German immigrants who possessed both substantial savings and knowledge of their homeland's banking systems that could be valuable for establishing new identities in California. But the Hoffman elimination in June 1882 differed from all previous operations because it was motivated by greed rather than necessity and because it was planned hastily rather than with the careful preparation that had characterized their earlier crimes. A successful merchant in Prussia had been Klaus Hoffman before immigrating to Kansas with his wife Greta and their 3 teenage children. He had sold his European business interests for a substantial sum, converting his wealth into American currency and government bonds that he planned to use for establishing a new trading operation in the American West. The largest single financial opportunity the Richardson family had ever encountered was represented by the Hoffman family's arrival at New Eden in May 1882. But Klaus Hoffman was also the most sophisticated victim they had ever targeted. His experience with international banking made him naturally suspicious of New Eden's unusual financial arrangements, and his knowledge of German immigrant communities across the Midwest meant that his disappearance would be more likely to trigger outside investigation than the elimination of isolated frontier families. The Richardson family's desperation to acquire the Hoffman assets before their planned departure led them to abandon their usual careful patience. Instead of spending months evaluating Klaus's psychology and planning his elimination, they decided to act within weeks of his arrival. Their first serious operational error in a decade of perfect crimes was led to by this haste. On the night of June 15, 1882, the Richardson family attempted to eliminate Klaus Hoffman using their standard technique of a private spiritual consultation in the prophet's house study. But Klaus had been suspicious of the community's operations since his arrival, and he had taken the precaution of telling his wife Greta to expect his return by midnight and to alert other community members if he failed to appear. When unexpected resistance was encountered by Joshua Richardson as he attempted to overpower Klaus during the fake spiritual session. Not only was Klaus Hoffman younger and stronger than previous victims, but he was also prepared for the possibility of violence. Loud and prolonged was the struggle that followed, creating noise that could be heard throughout the prophet's house and raising the possibility that other community members might investigate. More seriously, Klaus managed to wound Joshua with a letter opener before being killed, creating a blood trail and obvious signs of violence that could not be explained away as natural death or accident. For the first time in their criminal careers, the Richardson family faced the challenge of explaining obvious evidence of murder to community members who had been awakened by the sounds of struggle. Characteristically audacious but ultimately self-destructive was their solution. The next morning, Prophet Isaiah announced that Klaus Hoffman had been possessed by demonic forces during their spiritual consultation, requiring a violent exorcism that had ultimately resulted in the demon's departure and Klaus's peaceful death. This explanation satisfied the traumatized community members who had heard the struggle, but it also created the first cracks in the Richardson family's reputation for divine authority and peaceful community leadership. Devastated by Klaus's death and terrified by the supernatural explanations they had been given, Greta Hoffman and her children readily accepted Prophet Isaiah's revelation that they were called to return to Germany as missionaries to their former homeland. Their departure from New Eden was scheduled for early July, supposedly to catch a ship from New York back to Europe. But the Hoffman family never left Kansas alive. And their elimination on July 3, 1882, was witnessed by someone the Richardson family had never considered a threat. 8-year-old Timothy Weber, son of one of New Eden's most devoted families, had been hiding in the prophet's house barn during a game of hide-and-seek when the murders occurred. Joshua Richardson loading bodies into a wagon was seen by Timothy, and instructions about burial locations in the memorial garden were heard given by Elder Sarah. Too young to understand the full implications of what he had witnessed was the child, but he was old enough to realize that the Hoffman family had not actually departed for Germany as announced to the community. The first serious crack in the Richardson family's control over community information was created by Timothy's innocent questions to his parents about why the Hoffmans were buried in the garden instead of traveling to Germany. When Timothy's father, Elder Weber, approached Prophet Isaiah with his son's confused report, explanations that seemed increasingly strained and inconsistent were received by him. For the first time in 11 years, a member of New Eden's community began to seriously question the official explanations for mysterious deaths and sudden departures. A level of internal threat that the Richardson family had never faced before was created by Elder Weber's growing suspicions, combined with his knowledge of Timothy's eyewitness account. Just when everything seems to be coming to a head in this terrifying tale of New Eden, I want to pause for a moment. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit like to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Even more shocking than what we've uncovered so far is the truth about what happened next. Let's discover together how this house of horrors finally came crashing down. That their decade of perfect murders had finally created a witness they could not eliminate without destroying the community that provided cover for their crimes was about to be discovered by the Richardson family. Not with law enforcement, but with a persistent mother named Catherine Brennan McKenna, the older sister of Patrick Brennan, who had been murdered in 1878, began the investigation that would ultimately expose the Richardson family's crimes. Catherine lived in St. Louis, where her husband, Michael McKenna, worked as a federal customs inspector. Unlike most relatives of New Eden's victims, Catherine possessed both the resources and the government connections necessary to pursue a thorough investigation into her brother's disappearance. Troubled had been Catherine by the complete lack of communication from Patrick's family since their supposed departure for Colorado missionary work in April 1878. A faithful correspondent throughout his adult life had been Patrick, writing regularly to his sister even during the most difficult periods of his farming struggles in Missouri. Entirely out of character seemed his complete silence after joining New Eden, especially given that he had 6 children whose lives Catherine would have expected him to share through letters. In the spring of 1882, Catherine convinced her husband to use his federal connections to make official inquiries about the Brennan family's whereabouts. Federal Indian agents in Colorado Territory, railroad companies that handled passenger traffic to mining regions, and Catholic missionary organizations that worked among Irish immigrants in the Western Territories were contacted by Michael McKenna. Disturbing were the results. No record existed of any family named Brennan engaging in missionary activities in Colorado or any other Western location during the specified time periods. Armed with this information, Catherine and Michael traveled to Kansas in August 1882, determined to visit New Eden and demand answers about Patrick's family. Very differently would their investigation have proceeded if they had announced their arrival in advance. But fortunately for the cause of justice, they decided to approach New Eden unannounced, hoping to observe the community's normal operations before revealing their purpose. A community that seemed prosperous and well-organized, but also strangely tense and secretive was observed by Catherine and Michael during their 3-day reconnaissance of New Eden. They positioned themselves on hills overlooking the settlement, using Michael's military field glasses to study the daily routines of community members. Immediate questions about New Eden's operations and the Richardson family's explanations for missing relatives were raised by what they saw. Well-maintained and recently expanded were the community's buildings, suggesting access to significant financial resources that seemed inconsistent with a struggling religious settlement dependent on donations. Expensive farm equipment sat in the workshops, and the quality of livestock visible in the pastures indicated substantial investment in agricultural operations that would require more capital than 35 frontier families could reasonably provide. More disturbing were the behavioral patterns noticed by Catherine among the community members. During evening gatherings visible through the meeting hall windows, people seemed to demonstrate an almost frantic enthusiasm for religious activities as if they were performing their devotion rather than expressing genuine spiritual joy. Subdued and watchful appeared children, exhibiting the kind of hyper-alert behavior Catherine recognized from her work with immigrants who had fled religious persecution in Ireland. Most significantly, something that confirmed their worst suspicions about New Eden's true nature was witnessed by Catherine and Michael. On their 3rd morning of observation, they saw Elder Weber approach Prophet Isaiah with what appeared to be urgent concerns, accompanied by his young son, Timothy. Clearly agitated was the conversation that followed, with Prophet Isaiah's usual commanding demeanor giving way to obvious anxiety and defensive gestures. That evening, Catherine and Michael approached New Eden openly, presenting themselves as relatives of Patrick Brennan and demanding to speak with community leaders about his family's current location. A stir of activity that confirmed their suspicions was created by their arrival. This was not a community accustomed to unexpected visitors or comfortable with outside scrutiny. In the community's meeting hall, Prophet Isaiah Richardson met them, flanked by Elder Sarah and Joshua. Smooth and confident was his initial response to their inquiries, explaining that the Brennan family had indeed departed for missionary work in Colorado and was doing excellent work among Irish miners in remote mountain valleys. Letters supposedly written by Patrick describing the family's successful ministry and their plans to establish a permanent mission station in an isolated location were produced by him. But not spent 40 years reading her brother's correspondence without learning to recognize his handwriting and writing style had Catherine. Obvious forgeries were the letters Prophet Isaiah showed her. Similar, but not identical, was the handwriting, and formal and religious in a way that Patrick, despite his spiritual devotion, had never used in personal correspondence was the language. Most damning, incorrect geographical references that Catherine knew were incorrect were contained in the letters, describing mining operations in locations where no such activities existed. These letters were not written by my brother, Catherine stated flatly, her Irish temper beginning to show. Patrick would never describe the Colorado Rockies as having gentle valleys suitable for farming and family settlement. He served in the Colorado Territory during the war, and he knew those mountains were harsh and dangerous. The first serious cracks in the Richardson family's carefully constructed facade were revealed by the confrontation that followed. Nothing to Catherine McKenna, who had been raised in the Irish Catholic tradition of questioning Protestant ministers, met Prophet Isaiah's religious authority. Impossible to dismiss their concerns or intimidate them into leaving made her husband's federal credentials. Most importantly, their announced intention to report New Eden to territorial authorities meant that the Richardson family could not simply make them disappear like previous troublemakers. When Michael McKenna, using his federal investigator training, began asking specific questions about New Eden's legal status and financial operations, came the breakthrough. How was the community's land ownership documented? What records existed of the substantial property transfers that would be necessary for families to donate their worldly goods to the community treasury? Where were the tax records that territorial law required for large agricultural operations? Evasive and inconsistent were Prophet Isaiah's responses to these questions. He claimed that community finances were managed through divine guidance rather than earthly record-keeping, that legal documentation was unnecessary for families who had transcended worldly concerns, and that tax obligations were handled through special arrangements with territorial authorities that outsiders couldn't understand. That New Eden was operating outside legal boundaries in ways that suggested criminal activity was confirmed by these answers. As a federal customs inspector, extensive experience recognizing financial fraud and property crime was had by him. Systematic theft on a massive scale was suggested by the community's obvious prosperity, combined with the lack of legitimate documentation for its resources. But it was 8-year-old Timothy Weber who provided the evidence that would finally expose the Richardson family's crimes. During the heated discussion between the adults, Timothy approached his father and whispered something that made Elder Weber's face turn pale with shock. When Elder Weber reluctantly shared his son's information, the truth about New Eden began to emerge. The Hoffman family's burial in Elder Sarah's memorial garden had been seen by Timothy, contradicting the official story of their departure for Germany. More importantly, his innocent questions had led Elder Weber to examine the garden more carefully, revealing disturbing inconsistencies in the soil and unusual arrangements of flowers that suggested systematic burial of multiple bodies over several years. That night, a decision that would finally bring justice to New Eden's victims was made by Catherine and Michael. Instead of confronting the Richardson family further, they quietly departed for Dodge City, where Michael's federal credentials would allow them to request an official investigation by territorial marshals. They carried with them Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony, Elder Weber's observations about the memorial garden, and most importantly, evidence of systematic financial fraud that would justify federal intervention. With growing panic, the Richardson family watched the McKennas leave, realizing that their perfect system was facing its most serious threat ever. For the first time in 11 years of successful murders, they faced investigation by federal authorities who possessed both the resources and the legal authority to expose their crimes. On September 10, 1882, when Deputy U.S. Marshal James Crawford arrived at the community with warrants to examine financial records and interview residents about missing persons reports filed by relatives in multiple states, began the federal investigation of New Eden. Accompanied was Crawford by a territorial attorney, a federal land office inspector, and 2 deputy sheriffs from Ford County. They also brought something the Richardson family had never encountered before, legal authority that transcended religious claims and community autonomy. A community in the grip of carefully controlled panic was found by the investigators during their first day at New Eden. The previous 3 weeks had been spent by the Richardson family preparing for this possibility, coaching community members on appropriate responses to official questions and hiding or destroying evidence that might reveal the true scope of their crimes. But they had also made a fatal error that would ultimately expose everything. So confident in their system had they become that they had kept detailed records of their victims' property and possessions, believing these records would serve as evidence of legitimate business transactions rather than proof of systematic murder. Almost anticlimactic was Marshal Crawford's discovery of the hidden vault beneath the prophet's house. After hours of examining suspicious financial records and interviewing terrified community members, the vault contained personal belongings from 9 families carefully catalogued and stored with the efficiency of a criminal enterprise. Family photographs, personal Bibles, children's toys, wedding rings, and most damning of all, identity documents that proved these families had never left New Eden alive. But Elder Sarah's memorial garden, the beautiful flower beds where she had spent 11 years carefully tending blooms above the graves of her victims, was the physical evidence that finally broke the case. When investigators began excavating the garden based on Timothy Weber's eyewitness testimony and his father's observations, they uncovered a carefully organized cemetery containing the remains of 47 men, women, and children buried in family groups with their personal possessions and arranged with the same meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of the Richardson family's criminal activities. Swift and absolute was the Richardson family's arrest. Prophet Isaiah Richardson, Elder Sarah Richardson, and Joshua Richardson were taken into custody and charged with 9 counts of first-degree murder, along with numerous charges of fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Traumatized by the revelation that they had been living above a mass grave for years, the surviving members of New Eden provided testimony that painted a horrifying picture of systematic manipulation, religious abuse, and calculated murder. One of the most sensational criminal cases in Kansas territorial history became the trial of the Richardson family, attracting newspaper coverage from across the nation and sparking congressional debates about federal oversight of religious communities. Not just the scope of their crimes, but the sophisticated psychological techniques they had used to maintain control over their victims and conceal their activities from outside scrutiny were revealed by the evidence presented during the proceedings.